The Canon RF 85mm 1.2 lens has long been the undisputed king of portraits on the Canon RF mount, but there's a new kid on the block, and that's the Canon RF 135mm 1.8 lens. In this video I'm going to be comparing the two side by side for portraits, taking a look at things like rendering, sharpness and handling. We'll also take a look at how both perform in video, since the new 135mm has lens IS. The Canon 135mm f2 on EF mount was a favourite amongst portrait and wedding photographers, so I'm really excited to see what Canon have done with the reboot of the 135mm and see what kind of improvements they've made over the already amazing original. So let's get started. So let's start out with a mid-length portrait on the 135mm. My immediate reaction was that this is a super sharp lens, even wide open, and I love the compression and rendering. Let's compare the same crop, but this time let's take the shot with the Canon RF 85mm 1.2 at 1.2. I don't need to be anywhere near as far away as I was when I was using the 135mm for this same crop. Here's the 85mm shot. Looking at them side by side, they are quite similar. The 85mm does still have more background blur though, but it's a close one and they both do an amazing job at taming that busy background. Now let's look at a full length shot back on the 135mm, where you can see I'm having to stand way further back now just to be able to get this shot. Here's the shot. The lens definitely has that 3D pop I usually associate with 1.2 primes. Colours, contrast and compression are all very impressive. Taking the same shot again with the 85mm, again I'm much closer. I prefer working at these kind of closer distances that the 85mm provides. It's easier to communicate and direct with the model. Here's the shot, and honestly I think the 85mm 1.2 is the best lens on the market for full length shots like this. Tons of 3D pop and the focus fall off is amazing and smooth. Looking at the shot side by side, I do prefer the 85mm. That little bit of extra separation makes a pretty big difference in these full length shots. But let's see how the lenses compare in a few more scenarios so we can get a feel for the characteristics of each focal length and lens. With the 135mm, it's easy to fill the frame with interesting small pockets of colour in the background thanks to the compression at that distance. On the 85mm, for example, you can see a little bit of the background creeping in that lower right hand corner, which is hidden on the 135mm. Overall, I really love these shots. The 135mm is a little flat compared to the 85, which is just the nature of a longer focal length. You could argue the 135mm is more flattering on facial features though. What do you think? Moving outside to this fountain, here's a good example how the longer working distance of the 135mm results in the background appearing closer to the subject, in this case the fountain and the trees. Again, we are much closer on the 85mm, resulting in the fountain taking up less of the frame and the trees in the background seeming much further away. Let's take a look at them side by side. And again, the difference compression makes on facial features is quite apparent here. The 85mm gives a thinner, more 3D look with slightly more exaggerated facial features, whereas the 135mm is much flatter. Let's take a look at one more example. Again, I love longer focal lengths for shots like these. You can just find a small patch of interesting background and easily fill the frame with it. Side by side, we see again that bit of extra background blur and separation on the 85mm. But honestly, they both look amazing. So let's take this opportunity to take a quick look at sharpness between these lenses. So let's dive into Lightroom and take a look how this new 135mm lens performs in terms of sharpness, and then we'll also compare it to the 85mm and see if we can see if one is better than the other. So let's start with this shot, and this is the 135mm lens shot wide open in a kind of mid-length shot, and zooming in on the eye 100%, it pretty much does not get any better than that. You can see all the detail in the eyelashes. The eye is resolved perfectly, all that detail in the iris and the eyebrow, tons of skin detail, It really truly is pretty much as sharp as I've ever seen on the RF mount. You can see with that depth of field that that left eye is falling out of focus, but everything that is in the plane of focus is exceptional in terms of sharpness and micro contrast. So now let's put it up against the 85mm 1.2 and see if we can spot if one is better than the other. So again, zooming in at 100% on the face, we can see at that right eye that both of them are just razor sharp. I can't immediately pick out a winner. Again, it's important to remember that the 135mm is at 1.8 and the 85mm is at 1.2, so there's going to be a much thinner depth of field on the 85mm, which might give the illusion that it's actually not quite as sharp as the 135. But if we concentrate on the eye, which is in focus, I'm finding it really difficult to decide if one is sharper than the other. If you really push me to give an answer, I might say the 85mm 1.2 is the slightly sharper lens. So for me, when choosing between these lenses, I don't think sharpness and ability to resolve detail is something you need to worry about. Here's a short video clip using the 135mm, and for static shots, that lens IS is amazing at this focal length. This would be great for filming something like sports, for example. You can see on the 85mm, although a more usable focal length for video in my opinion, it's not quite as stable without that lens IS. Looking at build and handling, the 135mm looks very similar to other RFL lenses, but does have some new tricks up its sleeve. It feels very well built, yet surprisingly light in the hand despite it being a heavy lens at 900 grams. I think this is because the weight is distributed nicely throughout the lens, so it's not front heavy at all. This is the first Canon lens I've seen with this additional function button. A cool addition, but personally not too sure what I would use it for. It has a pretty standard 82mm filter thread for a lens of this size. Here's the included lens hood, which is pretty large, almost doubling the length of the lens when used. Now for comparison, here's the 85mm, which is heavier at 1.2 kg, and you really feel it. This extra weight seems distributed more to the front of the lens, making it a very front-heavy lens and less comfortable to use. Side by side, you can see that they are similar in length, but the 85mm is quite a bit wider, meaning you'll have an easier time fitting the 135mm in most camera bags. Overall, the RF 135mm 1.8 is Canon at its best in terms of handling. It's really nice to use on a full frame body like the R5. The 85mm isn't bad by any means, but you'll feel that weight and it just doesn't handle quite as nice. So that rounds out the comparison. Let me know down in the comments which of these two lenses you would choose for portraits, or maybe you wouldn't choose either and would go for something like a 70-200 for the flexibility, or you go wider with something like the 50mm 1.2. I'm really loving Canon's reboot of this 135mm lens. It has amazing image quality and performance with great build quality to match. I think this lens is perfect for portraits and things like studio headshots. It's also going to be great for other things like indoor sports and weddings where the extra reach over the 85mm is going to really help. Choosing between the 135mm and the 85 is really just going to come down to your personal preference in terms of focal length, since these two are pretty well matched in terms of performance and image quality. I personally prefer to capture a little more of the background in my portraits, which is why I tend to gravitate to lenses such as the 50mm 1.2. So for me personally, I'm going to be sticking with the 85mm 1.2 for a little while longer. But again, please let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I hope this quick video helped you if you are lucky enough to be choosing between one of these two amazing portrait lenses. Thanks again for watching, and I will catch you guys in the next one.